This essay will be evaluating the implications of environmental art therapy practice and whether there is a need for new policies to be developed to allow art therapy to be taken outdoors safely.
Environmental art therapy is a therapeutic use of natural materials, natural locations, natural themes and natural cycles. It is a steep connection to turning year, its seasons, its stories and its traditions that make it so much more than just art therapy.
My interviewee is an environmental art therapist who works at an organisation that integrates ecotherapy and art therapy concepts to provide a therapeutic service.
And I never cease to be amazed about the powerful metaphors that exist in nature that you can use, because you're still using a physical third object.
Although ecopsychology has been around for 20 years, there is still no specific guidelines for environmental art therapy. As there are no set guidelines, we must still follow the guidelines already in place by HCPC and BAN. Being in an artificial environment of a house, school or institution increases anxiety levels. Tim Jordan discusses research that the Charity Mind carried out.
They placed people in Blue Water Shopping Centre, they measured their levels of distress and anxiety, and then they placed the same people in a park and they measured their levels of distress and anxiety. People were less distressed in the park. Things about connection to nature and growing things and being out in nature as being fundamentally linked to kind of better mental health.
In terms of biophilia, it's actually an innate response that people have. It's within us to living things, and it's part of our ultimate human nature.
However, my interviewee discusses the contrary argument.
It again comes down to the individual person and what relationship they had with the land on which they came from. If they came from an urban setting into an urban setting, then maybe that's what they'd feel more comfortable is within the four walls. But if they came with a situation where they had a relationship with their countryside, maybe that would open things up for them countryside here or nearby nature. But it might bring up some interesting work to be done with them about the sense of loss. I mean, to me, it's kind of sort of if you were forced from a situation where you had an intimate relationship with the land in a totally different country or even a different continent, how would that be if you tried to work outdoors in a landscape that's totally different? It might bring up some work about grieving for the landscape. It would have to be thought about quite carefully, and I think that prior to that sort of work, you would have to talk to the clients to find out how they feel about it. You can integrate the back guidelines with reading and the work that has already gone before.
However, there is a dispute in whether the guidelines created for indoor art therapy can correspond to the environmental art therapy needs in relation to setting boundaries, which is ultimately what psychotherapists call the therapeutic frame. Langs describes the therapeutic frame of psychotherapy to relate to the professional and ethical conduct of the psychotherapist and contribute to the safety of the endeavour for both therapist and client.
So as far as containment outside is concerned, it's more of an emotional containment by the therapist than the four walls. So you have to do slightly more work, be slightly more aware of what's going on, the dynamic between you. And that's not only through the art making, but also through, verbal engagement, and also how, as I said before, people are physically in the space. So it's about providing that sort of containment. But also, as well, you can find enclosed areas that have more containment and more privacy to them. There's several instances, as I say, when I had members of the public wander in when I'm, running a group. But you just learn how to sort of gently steer people away.
David L. Smith developed the 21 fundamental ground rules within psychotherapy, which therapists still utilise in their practice today. In order to hold clear boundaries, psychotherapy needed to be conducted in an indoor space where issues such as role, time, place and space, language, self-disclosure, and related matters such as physical contact could be controlled. Therefore, by taking therapy outdoors, one must re-evaluate these conditions and provide a safe way to handle any issue that may be affected at any one time whilst in therapy in the outdoor environment. When artwork is created in nature during an environmental art therapy session, it is for the most part left in its original environment, which is contrary practice to the traditional art therapy, where artwork is kept safely and held to look back at any moment in time. The therapist must assess how leaving the artwork behind would affect their client.
I've generally found that if you're working in a community garden or an organised space, there's often a shed that you can leave art in from week to week. I've also, the first pilot project I ran, I made sure that we had a collection of the work photographed that I then presented to the clients on CDs, which they were very, had a very positive reaction to that.
Both these effects might be found to be symbolic to something negative for the client and could possibly have an opposing effect to the desired therapeutic outcome. An opposing argument is a concept of scapegoat transference, a psychological approach which has been prompted from the mythological worldviews. Scapegoating, as it is generally understood, is separating the good from the bad and disposing of the bad. The ritual is completed and a resolution effected once the scapegoat has been disposed of. In this instance, leaving artwork behind as a sentiment to leaving negative feelings behind can be effective in therapy.
I think in terms of confidentiality, that obviously if you're out in nature with a client and you've got the general public wandering about, you have to work with that. I've been mistaken for a park ranger more than once, but it's kind of I think it depends on your experience. I come from a background of working with very flexible boundaries, where you're navigating boundaries constantly through an open studio model.
This discussion then leads to the argument of how a client should be assessed, whereby the therapist should be asking whether environmental art therapy is the right type of therapy for the client. There are particular risk factors that a therapist has to consider when taking art therapy outdoors. For instance, how close can a client come in contact with a person from the public, and is the client safe enough physically and mentally to interact with other people? The type of space environmental art therapy utilises is another factor to take into consideration, as the following questions have to be asked. Does the client have any physical impairment that would prevent them from being in this space, for example a plant allergy or a walking injury? These issues, which would not historically affect the ability for a client to access art therapy, has a massive impact on environmental art therapy. I went to an environmental art therapy workshop led by Gary Nash on the 18th of February 2017 in Highgate Woods. The implication that I personally encountered was where the workshop was situated and how easy it was to get lost, where either going to the toilet and trying to find my way back, or when going for a walk on my own as part of the workshop. And where this is an open space, this is an implication for a vulnerable client. Simon goes on to explain a solution to this problem.
Generally working outdoors is better when you're co-facilitating. If somebody gets lost or somebody becomes unwell, was one of you to deal with that and the other one of you to stay with the group.
Environmental art therapy in England is practiced by some therapists by following Ian Hidden's book, Environmental Art Therapy and the Tree of Life, which focuses and utilises Celtic wisdom. Whilst this knowledge gives steps in relation to responding to nature, one can argue that this focus to practicing can shy away people of other cultures and reduce the number of clients who would interact with this therapy.
Because environmental arts therapy in this country, as you quite rightly, deals with a lot of Celtic imagery. I had a couple of people who said that they couldn't go on it because of their religious beliefs and because they saw Celtic imagery as paganism. So that really started me thinking about this.
To light a multicultural issue, and the question arises whether environmental art therapy should stop focusing on Celtic knowledge and symbolism.
Christian mythology does get mixed into environmental arts therapy as well, but I've steered my practice away from that. Initially I thought that I would be losing a lot of rich material to work with, but I haven't found that that's the case. It's more about how we emotionally react to the seasons, to the change of the seasons, to what month we're in, what's going on around for us. There's still very rich metaphors out there that you don't have to rely on Celtic mythology. It just takes a bit of time to think about those, and that comes out from your own mythology, your own kind of sort of relationship with the land. That can inform your practice about whether you include that or not. I mean, it's perfectly valid to include that, but I think that times have changed so much that integrating the basic human relationship with the natural world is much more useful on a broader scale than just the Celtic mythology.
Consistency is a strong binder to the therapeutic relationship. However, when taking therapy outdoors, consistency may not always be available, where uncontrollable factors like weather can affect the timing and even lead to last-minute cancellation.
So as long as a therapist is transparent about things that may have been awkward or difficult to deal with, you can work with that material. What does it mean to a client if it starts raining? It's in a way, it's a form of vitality effect. It's exactly the same as if they start to work with watery materials.
The idea that there is a fundamental vitality, a life force in nature, however you want to position that.
Throughout this video, I have taken into consideration the appropriate policies that an art therapist has to observe. It can be strongly argued that there are enough policies in place to take art therapy outdoors safely. And it can be further argued that developing more policies would over-professionalise the practice. As Toten argues, what is the opposite of being boundaried? One answer is unboundaried, another is boundless, which equates to the argument that over-legislating the process of environmental art therapy, the free spirit which drives the therapeutic aspect can be lost. However, Berger in 2008 discusses his concerns about ethical conduct in ecotherapy. Therefore, environmental art therapy must be mindful of environment-appropriate safeguards in place, but these should not visibly impact upon the therapeutic experience. Environmental art therapy must follow all of the guidelines set by BAT and HCPC.